Here's PragerU to make excuses for a supposedly all-powerful God allowing suffering.
All good people are appalled by the sufferings of the innocent. When an innocent person is struck by a painful disease, or tortured, or murdered, we naturally feel sadness and helplessness and often rage. Many people have claimed that such suffering is a proof that God does not exist.
Well, more specifically, it shows that if the universe was created by some kind of conscious being, that being is either not entirely loving or not all-powerful. An all-loving creator would only allow suffering if that suffering were in some sense unavoidable. But it would only be unavoidable to a being that didn't have the power to avoid it. If a being is able to prevent suffering but chooses not to, then I have no idea what it would mean to say that such a being is all-loving.
Their argument goes like this. God is all good and all-powerful. Such a God would not permit unnecessary suffering.
No, such a God would prevent any suffering, rather than just unnecessary suffering, because if that God is really all-powerful, then there would be no such thing as necessary suffering. The idea of necessary suffering implies that there could be some suffering that is unavoidable to an all-powerful God. If a God really is all-powerful, then that God has the power to avoid any and all suffering.
Yet we constantly observe unjust suffering.
The existence of any suffering at all proves that if there is a creator of the universe, that creator is either not all-loving or not all-powerful.
Therefore, at least one of the premises about God must be false. Either God is not all good, or he is not all-powerful, or he just doesn't exist. What's wrong with this argument?
What's wrong with this argument is that it allows for the existence of an all-loving and all-powerful God who tolerates necessary suffering. If a God is really all-powerful, then that God has the power to accomplish any goal without allowing any suffering at all. In a universe created by such a God, there could be no such thing as necessary suffering. The idea that suffering could be in any way necessary implies that there is a God who does not have the power to achieve his goals without allowing at least some suffering. If there is a God at all, such a God would clearly not be all-powerful.
First, let's examine what we mean when we say that God would not permit unjust suffering.
An all-loving and all-powerful God would not permit any suffering.
There are two categories of suffering. Suffering caused by human beings, which we call moral evils, and suffering caused by nature, for instance, earthquakes or cancer. Free will explains how God could be good and allow moral evil.
No, it doesn't. First of all, there's no reason to believe we have free will. Secondly, even if we did, the fact that we have it would be a bad thing insofar as it allows us to commit evil acts. I don't understand how a God who is all-loving and all-powerful wouldn't create us to be morally infallible rather than creating us with free will. Why would free will be preferable to moral infallibility? And why would these things even necessarily be contrary to one another? Does God himself not have free will? If God can have both free will and never do anything evil, then why could he not have created humans who both have free will and never use it to do anything evil? If God does not have free will, then why do we need it? If having no free will is good enough for God, why wouldn't it be good enough for us?
Because God has given people free will, they are free to behave against God's will.
Why would that be good at all, let alone good enough to justify the suffering that people cause to each other?
The fact that they do evil does not prove that God is not good.
It proves that either he is not all good, or he has some goal that he does not have the power to achieve without allowing us to do evil things, in which case he is not all-powerful.
In addition, if there were no God, there would be no absolute standard of good.
And if there is a God, that God does not live up to his own absolute standard, unless he is not all-powerful. That's the whole point of the argument. There is no problem of evil if there is no God, because the existence of suffering doesn't contradict the idea that there is no being both willing and capable to prevent it.
Every judgment presupposes a standard. And that's true of our moral judgments too. What is our standard for judging evil to be evil? The most we could say about evil, if there were no God, was that we, in our subjective tastes, didn't like it when people did certain things to other people.
So what's God's standard? When he declares something evil, is he appealing to some independently existing standard, or does he simply not like it?
We wouldn't have a basis for saying an act was bad, only that we didn't like it.
And why would it be better to say that something is bad because God doesn't like it? The existence of a God would not make morality any more objective, because God himself is a subject. Any judgment dependent upon the existence of a subject is, by definition, subjective.
So the problem of human evil exists only if God exists.
Which is precisely why it proves that the idea of an all-powerful and all-loving God is contradicted by the existence of suffering. If such a God exists, the fact that he either does not have the power or does not have the goodness to prevent suffering is a contradiction. If he does not exist, there is no contradiction. This fact is contrary to the idea that a God exists, not evidence for such an idea.
As for natural suffering, that poses what appears to be a more difficult question. We see an innocent child suffer, say, from an incurable disease.
If you see anyone at all suffer from anything at all, this is incompatible with a God which is both all-loving and all-powerful.
We complain. Understandable. We don't like it. Understandable. We feel it is wrong, unfair, and shouldn't happen. Understandable. But illogical unless you believe in God.
None of those judgments are illogical if you understand them to be subjective.
For if you do not believe in God, your subjective feelings are the only basis upon which you can object to natural suffering.
So what? Why does an objection need an objective basis? And even if there is a God, such an objection would also be subjective, because a moral system based on God, who is himself a subject, would still be subjective.
Okay, you don't like it, but how is your not liking something evidence for God not existing?
Because if a God is necessarily all-powerful and all-loving, then such a God would not allow any situation that is disliked by anyone. I don't understand what it means to say that a being is holy and perfectly loving if such a being willfully allows even the slightest suffering. Some may argue that some suffering is necessary for happiness, but insofar as that is true, it's a property of human psychology, not a logical necessity. A God which is all-powerful would have the power to create humans who do not need suffering to achieve happiness.
Our judgments of good and evil, natural as well as human, presuppose God as the standard.
No, they don't. We can make our own judgments based on our own standards. If there is an all-powerful God, however, and that God provides a moral standard, then we have to concede that by such a God's standard, that child's suffering is good from the perspective of that God. If that's the case, then what does it mean to say that such a God is all-loving?
If there's no God, there's neither good nor evil. There's just nature, doing what it does.
And if there is a God, then such a God either doesn't have the power to prevent such suffering, in which case he is not all-powerful, or he thinks such suffering is good, in which case it's not clear at all what it means to say that he is all-loving.
If nature is all there is absolutely no need to explain why one person suffers and another doesn't.
I agree, and if there is a God, then there is a need to explain what it means to say that he is both all-powerful and all-loving if he has the power to prevent all suffering, but he does not. I don't understand what it means to say that he is all-loving if he does not prevent suffering that he has the power to prevent. And if he is really all-powerful, then he, by definition, has the power to prevent any and all suffering. This dude's objection seems to be, effectively, that it is only a contradiction if God exists. He seems to think that bringing this objection proves that God exists when it actually does the opposite. It proves that an all-powerful and all-loving God is contrary to observed reality.
Unjust suffering is a problem only because we have a sense of what is just and unjust.
No, it's only a logical problem if there is a God who allegedly has both the desire and ability to oppose the unjust.
But where does this sense come from?
Evolution and socialization give us consciences that can tolerate some actions and not others.
Certainly not from nature.
Certainly not only from nature, but it is clearly at least partly from nature because we see it even in non-human species.
There's nothing just about nature.
Nature doesn't have to be just to give us consciences that either tolerate or fail to tolerate certain actions. To assume that nature has to be just to give us intuitions about justice is a genetic fallacy.
Nature is only about survival.
More specifically, evolution is about survival. The reason why evolution hardwired humans and other animals with a sense of righteous indignation at certain actions is because such a sense helps prevent our extinction.
What, in other words, does it mean for suffering to be unnecessary or wrong? How is that determined? Against what standard?
It's unnecessary if one has the power to prevent it. If there is an all-powerful God, then such a God, by definition, has the power to prevent any and all suffering.
Your private standard means nothing. My private standard means nothing.
You don't need a private standard to understand that an all-powerful being, by definition, has the power to achieve any goal without allowing suffering. That's true by logical necessity rather than any private standard.
We can talk meaningfully about suffering being unnecessary or wrong only if we have an underlying belief that a standard of right and wrong objectively exists.
To say that allowing suffering is objectively wrong implies an objective standard of right and wrong, but the question of whether or not suffering is necessary does not. Whether it is necessary is a matter of logic rather than morality.
And if that standard really exists, that means there is a God.
No, it doesn't, because God is a subject. Even if there is a God who dictates morality, morality is still subjective.
Moreover, the believer in God has an incomparably easier time than the atheist psychologically, as well as logically, in dealing with the problem of natural suffering.
The exact opposite is true, because the atheist doesn't have to square the circle that there is both suffering and an all-loving being who has the power to eliminate suffering, but who simply chooses not to.
If you accept that a good God exists, it is possible to also believe that this God somehow sets things right, if not in this world, then in the next.
If an all-loving and all-powerful God exists, such a God would only allow things to be right in all conceivable worlds.
For the atheist, on the other hand, no suffering is ever set right. There is no ultimate justice. The bad win and the good suffer. Earthquakes and cancers kill. End of story.
Which is entirely logically consistent with a reality in which nobody has both the power and desire to prevent suffering, and contradicts the idea of a being which has both the power and desire to prevent such events.
If nature is all there is, how can a sensitive person remain sane in a world in which tsunamis wipe out whole towns, evil men torture and murder innocent victims, and disease attacks people indiscriminately?
How is that an argument for anything? At least I don't have to employ doublethink to simultaneously believe that there is a being who has the power to prevent these things and who is loving, but who chooses not to prevent these things.
The answer is, it's not possible.
Again, how is that an argument that such a painful reality is not, in fact, the one we live in?
To everyone who helps me out on Patreon, you're a big help. Thanks so much.